Good morning, or good morning. Man, I am so conditioned to say good morning, but it's awesome to see your smiling faces out there. Feels like morning. Okay, well, good evening, and welcome to this evening, and we get the special privilege of enjoying Mr. William Federer speak, and he's got a great topic for us tonight, and he's also got, I saw some of you out there looking at the merchandise table where he's got the books that he's written and the DVDs and whatnot, and so there'll be a time when you can step back there and check those out. And so before we get started, I'll open us in prayer, and we'll seek the Lord for this evening. Father God, we thank you so much for just the clarity of your word, that you don't leave us wondering what's going on in the world or what is our place in the world or what will come, but you're very clear, Lord, and we thank you for raising up men such as William Federer to help further clarify that for us, Lord, through his hard work, and Lord Jesus, we thank you for your sacrifice, and we pray, Lord, through the power of the Holy Spirit, that we are equipped and aware and ever dependent on your word, God, to lead us and guide us, and so we just pray that you would superintend this evening, Lord, and equip us to be aware of the times that we live in. And so we pray for that in Jesus' name. Amen. And so now we'll welcome up Mr. William Federer.
Well, thank you. Well, it is great to be here, and thank you for coming out tonight, especially with the potential of weather, and I think it'll be worth your while. So I've written about 25 books over the last 25 years, and the one on socialism is one that sort of combines things from all of them, and it's a big picture of what's happening in the world today by looking at history. I tell people history is not prophetic, but it is predictive. So past behavior is the best indicator of future performance. So you put some knowledge of history with the prophetic, you get a pretty good idea where things are headed, right? So with that, let me just jump into my talk. I have a website, AmericanMinute.com, and I send out a daily email of something that happened on each date in history. Always brings out faith, but you can sign up for it. And so this is my book, and the subtitle, or the title is Socialism, the Real History from Plato to the Present. And you think, why Plato? He's the first one that talked about everybody owning everything in common. And it sounds great until you think it through. Somebody's got to be in the government handing out all this common stuff. And they like their job. And they're always going to be tempted to give a little extra to their family and friends on the side. And they're always going to be tempted to hold back from someone they just don't like. And before you know it, it gets discretionary. And the saying is, he who holds the purse strings has the power. And so every attempt at everybody owning everything equally always ends up with a deep state bureaucracy that hands it all out, ruled by the most corrupt politician at the top, a dictator. Anyway, so Plato lived 380 BC in Athens, and he writes in passing of Atlantis, this highly structured civilization on an island that predates him by 800 years, and he describes it. It's all organized and the canals and the houses, and he considers this the ideal structured society, but it sank in the sea. Now, whether it existed or not, he thought that it did, and there is an island in the Mediterranean called Santorini, and it is what's left of a volcano. And I actually visited it in college. It's a nice little Greek village that goes along the cliff of this volcano. And when it blew up, it would have destroyed lots of civilizations around the Mediterranean with a tsunami. Well, Plato considered this this Atlantis, the perfect structured society. Everybody say structured. And then Plato considered democracy an unstructured society. Everybody say unstructured. And demos means people, krasi means rule. So in a democracy, the people rule. And the chief characteristic of a democracy is tolerance. Everybody tolerates each other. It's wonderful. And then they tolerate people that are a little bit off. Then they tolerate people that are more off until it turns into lawlessness. And Plato says the state is like a bazaar at which you can buy anything, like a piece of embroidery, the greatest variety of human natures, such as democracy, a pleasing, lawless, various sort of government, a charming form of government full of variety and disorder. And then he talks about the manner of life is that of democrats. Every man does what is right in his own eyes. Now he's describing a democracy. But he goes on, then they tolerate disrespect in the home. The father gets accustomed to descend to the level of his son and fear him, and the son having no shame or fear of his parents. And then they tolerate disrespect in the classroom. The teacher fears and flatters his students. The students despise his masters and tutors. And then they tolerate financial irresponsibility, and the citizens vote to take the money from the city treasury and spread the wealth around. Now the treasury is empty. And then they vote to take the money from the rich. And he says the leaders deprive the rich of their estates and distribute them amongst the people. And then they tolerate immorality in their personal lives. He writes, the young man passes into freedom and libertinism of useless and unnecessary pleasures. There is no conceivable folly or crime, not excepting incest or any other unnatural union. He has parted company with all shame. Yes, that's what he's talking about. Matter of fact, a study was done by an Oxford anthropologist, J.D. Unwin, in 1934. He writes a book called Sex and Culture, and he studied Athens as well as 80 major civilizations over 5,000 years of history and saw some trends. And one of the trends that he saw was sexual promiscuity and loosening of sexual restraints always precedes civilizational collapse. And he talks about civilizations going through 4 stages. The first is a period of pain and poverty. They go through war, they go through famine, and they make it through that, and they work hard, and they work together, and they become productive and patriotic. And finally, they get prosperous. And then they want to enjoy their prosperity, and they get pleasure-focused and promiscuous, indulgent, undisciplined, lawless, weakened, and they get conquered by the next rising civilization. Sort of like an athlete. When he's young, he's focused and disciplined, watches his diet, and he does the push-ups, and he wants that prize, that championship. And then finally he gets it, and he is the champ for a couple seasons, and then he gets a little bit lazy, eats some fatty foods, doesn't exercise as much, and he gets challenged into the ring of competition. And in his mind, he still thinks he's the tough guy, but in reality, he's a couch potato, so he gets the tar knocked out of him. And so this is the way civilizations go. And J.D. Unwin even called it a sexual marketplace. He said, where women as a whole say nothing happens unless there is a commitment, the guys say whatever it takes. They make the commitment, and then they work hard to provide for their wife. And then the next thing that happens is little kids appear. And the guy has a new emotion of being protective. And when all the men of the country become productive and protective, rising water floats all boats. The whole country becomes productive and protective and creative and innovative and expansionistic and even militaristic. But when the women say there does not need to be a commitment, water seeks its own level, and you'll have a bunch of guys getting pleasure-focused and selfish and not caring as much about families and culture. And then when enough of the men of the country do this, there's fewer kids born to fill the ranks of the military, and the country gets conquered by the next rising civilization. And Plato says it's irreversible. Once a nation begins to go down this route, it's like a snowball that gains momentum, because human nature is on its side and wants that pleasure. And so John Adams writes to Thomas Jefferson, have you ever found in history one single example of a nation thoroughly corrupted that was afterwards restored to virtue, and without virtue there can be no political liberty? Will you tell me how to prevent luxury from producing effeminacy, intoxication, extravagance, vice, folly? No effort in favor of virtue is lost. And Harry S. Truman said, without a firm moral foundation, freedom degenerates into selfishness and anarchy. So Plato, he says, first they tolerate each other, it's great. Then they tolerate people that are a little bit off. Then they tolerate people that are a lot off, till finally they're tolerating lawlessness. and it turns into chaos. There's random violence and stores being looted and smashed and all kinds of insecurity for life and property. And then all the people say, can't someone come along and fix this mess? And that's when some governor comes along and he says, I can fix it. I just need some emergency powers. And Plato says, last of all comes the tyrant. When he first appears above ground, he's a protector. He's full of smiles. Right? I met him. He's really nice. He gives nice speeches. But then he begins to consolidate power. And when people see this, they begin to cast it in his teeth. And if any are suspected of resistance to his authority, he'll have a good pretext for destroying them. And how does this protector finally come out of the closet as a tyrant? Plato says he begins to grow unpopular. So tyrants have two tools in their toolbox, fraud and force. Fraud is they'll smile to you and take away your freedoms because they're telling you that they're doing it for your good, and as long as you let them, they'll keep taking it away. But as soon as you begin to see through it and realize that they're turning into a tyrant, they throw off the mask and they pull out their other tool, force. And that's when they pull out the police and the army and they send them out to punish demonstrators in the streets and so forth. And then finally, standing up in the chariot of state with the reins in his hand, a tyrant absolute. Having a mob entirely at his disposal, he's not restrained from shedding of blood. So, Plato, he said democracy's doomed to fail because it's based on the people having virtue, and people really don't have virtue. If you give them a choice of giving up their life or giving up their virtue, they'll always give up their virtue to save their life. Now, ancient Israel's attempt to rule themselves without a king lasted a little longer because they had a big magnet in the sky called God. And so people were virtuous because they were accountable to God. Athens did not have that. By Plato's time, they had a bunch of fickle deities that nobody believed in anyway, and they were only virtuous as long as it was the in thing to be virtuous. And Plato says, this thing's going to crash. Matter of fact, Plato said, if someone was born that truly had virtue, the world would crucify him. He writes this, 380 BC. If a truly just man lived, let him die as he lived. I might add that the just man will be scourged, racked, bound, and will at last be crucified. 380 BC, he wrote that. Anyway, Plato concluded that since democracy is doomed to fail, the best you can hope for is a nice tyrant. He called him a philosopher king. Now, let's say there is such a thing as a nice tyrant, but he doesn't live forever, so he's got to turn this power over to some son or grandson that's not a good ruler, but likes his position of power, and he becomes oppressive. A Bible example, Joseph, a godly man, concentrates power into the hands of the Pharaoh. And what did that Pharaoh do with the power? He fed the children of Israel, gave them the best land of Goshen, gave them jobs taking care of his cattle. But then there was a new Pharaoh that did not know Joseph, and he used all that concentrated power to oppress the children of Israel, make them slaves, and even throw their sons in the Nile River. That's the dilemma. We get our guy in there, and we let him usurp power because we think, well, he's on our side. But then it's all handed over to the next party, and they use it oppressively. So Plato said that the best you can hope for is a nice tyrant, and he gets to live a little bit better off because he's keeping things organized, and since it's better than a democracy, he gets to be the head of gold. And his administrators and military are the arms and chest of silver. And together they make up the ruling class. And everyone else is the abdomen of iron and bronze, and they are the ruled class. So socialism is a structured society of a ruling class and a ruled class. The ruling class, they're above the law. They're politically connected. They're supported by the commoners. They can live in really nice neighborhoods, and they can do special things like getting their hair styled when nobody else can. Remember Nancy Pelosi? Anyway, the ruled class. Yes, everyone is provided for, but nobody owns anything. Everything's held in common, and it's the ruling class that decides who gets what. It's the saying, he who holds the purse strings has the power. In Plato's perfect society, there are no families. The government decides who gets to have children. The government takes the children away from the parents and brings them into the city and indoctrinates them, socializes them, which is a process of getting them to give up their family's values and learn how to serve the ruling class. And Plato says that when the true philosopher kings are born in a state, they will set in order their own city. They will take possession of the children who will be unaffected by the habits of their parents. These they will train in their own habits and laws, right? They want to take this blank hard drive and they want to load their software onto it. And these children will be taught lies, noble lies. Plato said, we want one single grand lie which will be believed by everybody. And you think, well, gee, they're teaching the kids lies. Well, he says that the lies help the philosopher king to stay in power. And since he's better off than a democracy, it's okay to teach the kids lies. Could you imagine the government taking the kids away from the parents and teaching them lies? Anyway, Plato's perfect structured society on the island of Atlantis inspired Sir Thomas More's Island of Utopia in 1516. This is shortly after Columbus discovers America, and so some of these scholars in Europe are theorizing, gee, wouldn't it be great? We can set up a perfect society. And so Sir Thomas More, the word utopia means nowhere. It's a fictitious island off the coast of South America, discovered by Amerigo Vespucci, and it's written as a Greek dialogue, a conversation with a traveler named Hythlodaeus, which means peddler of nonsense. So we have the island of nowhere, told to us by the peddler of nonsense, and on this island, it's perfectly structured. There is an upper-class rulers, lower-class commoners. There's free health care, free identical clothing. Everyone receives free welfare. There's free meals in monastic communal dining halls. Everyone lives in free, identical, 3-story public housing. There's no locks on any doors. There's no private property. All property and goods are stored in a communal warehouse, and it's the ruling class that decides who gets what. There are no taverns, no alehouses, no coffee houses, no places for private gatherings. There's no privacy on Utopia. Everyone is tracked everywhere you go with an internal passport. If you're caught without it, it's a lifetime of slavery. This is 1516. He's talking about tracking everybody. The government decides everyone's careers. And there are no families on Utopia. The childbearing is regulated by the government, like the one-child policy in China or Planned Parenthood's Margaret Sanger. No woman shall have a legal right to bear a child without a permit. So, Plato's Island of Atlantis inspired Sir Thomas More's Island of Utopia, and that inspired Sir Francis Bacon's New Atlantis. He calls it New Atlantis because he's directly referring to Plato's Atlantis. And this is an island in the South Pacific, and it's a fictitious island. It's highly structured with a ruling class and commoners, a little more scientific careers, but the government controls everything. And someone wrote a satire on this, and you've read it, Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. Gulliver means gullible traveler, like Hythlodaeus, peddler of nonsense. And on this, Gulliver's washed up on an island and finds out it's highly structured with a ruling class that controls everything, and then the ruled class that just has to work their jobs. Why is this important? The Pilgrims. They had no money, so they found investors in England who formed the London Company, and they put up the money for their boat ride. And the investors wrote bylaws for the London Company. And the bylaws said that all profits and benefits that are got by trade, traffic, trucking, working, fishing, or any other means shall remain in ye common stock. And all are to have their meat, drink, and apparel and all provision out of ye common stock. Right? And so they got this from Sir Thomas More and Plato. Well, the Pilgrims tried it, and they almost starved to death. Nobody wanted to go out and plant, and Governor Bradford of the Pilgrims said the failure of that experiment of communal service, which was tried for several years by good and honest men, proves the emptiness of the theory of Plato and other ancients applauded by some of latter times. I just think this is amazing that the Pilgrims referred to Plato They knew that they were trying to live out this theoretical, hey, everybody owns everything in common. And William Bradford says that the taking away of private property and possession of it in community would make a state happy and flourishing as if they were wiser than God. For in this instance, community of property was found to breed much confusion and discontent and retard much employment, which would have been to the general benefit. For the young men who were most able and fit for service objected to being forced to spend their time and strength in working for other men's wives and children without any recompense. The strong man or the resourceful man had no more share of food, clothes, etc. than the weak man, who was not able to do a quarter what the other could. This was thought injustice. The aged and graver men, who were ranked and equalized in labor, food, clothes, etc., with the humbler and younger ones, thought it some indignity and disrespect to them. As for men's wives, who were obliged to do service for other men, such as cooking, washing their clothes, etc., they considered it a kind of slavery, and many husbands would not brook it or allow it. Let none argue that this is due to human failing, rather than to this communistic plan of life in itself. I answer that God, in his wisdom, saw that another plan of life was fitter for them. So they began to consider how to raise more corn, obtain a better crop, so they might not continue to endure the misery of want. After much debate, the governor, with the chief among them, allowed each man to plant corn for his own household. Wow, what a novel idea. Hey, you plant corn for your household. Bradford said, so every family was assigned a parcel of land. This was very successful. It made all hands very industrious, so that much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been, and gave far better satisfaction. The women now went willingly into the field and took their little ones with them to plant corn, while before they would allege weakness and inability, and to have compelled them would have been thought great oppression. So here we have this theoretical Plato and Sir Thomas More and Sir Francis Bacon, and the Pilgrims actually try to live it out. They almost starve to death, they scrap it, and they give everyone their own plot of land, and they survive, and we celebrate Thanksgivings. Now, wasn't the early church socialist? No, the early church was the early church. Socialism is counterfeit early church. And the differences between the word voluntary and involuntary, and church and government. So the early believers voluntarily sold their property and laid the money at the feet of the apostles for the church to distribute. They didn't have their land taken away and then be forced to involuntarily lay the money at the feet of Pilate for the Roman government to redistribute. When the children of Israel went into the promised land, every family was given property. If you own property, you can accumulate possessions. The Bible called that being blessed. And you can be moved upon in your heart to voluntarily give away some of your possessions. The Bible called that charity. Lenin said socialism is a transition phase from capitalism to communism. Capitalism empowering the individual and communism empowering the state. And Karl Marx says communism can be summed up in one sentence: abolition of private property. So if you don't own anything, how can you be charitable? How can you give away what you don't have? What, are you going to steal from somebody and break the law and now you're a thief? No, God entrusts you with stuff, and then you can have the opportunity to voluntarily manifest on the outside what spiritually is on the inside, the love of God in your heart, right, that you can give. And now, didn't Jesus teach socialism? Well, let's look at one, the parable of the talents. Gives one guy 5, multiplies it to 10, another guy 2, multiplies it to 4, and then 1. And the guy says, sir, here's your talent. I kept it locked away in a piece of cloth. His master replied, you wicked servant. He said to those standing by, take his talent from him and give it to the one who has 10. Sir, they said, he already has 10. He replied, I tell you that everyone who has more will be given, but to the one who has nothing, even what they have will be taken away. If Jesus were a socialist, he would have said, take from that guy that has 10 and redistribute it. No, he said, take from that lazy guy that hadn't done anything with it and give it to the guy that's going to do something with it. Right? The hand of the diligent shall bear rule. The name for the Holy Spirit is Paraclete, which means helper. God will help you do it. You don't sit back and say, okay, no, You go out there and do it, and the Holy Spirit helps you to do it. But you got to do something. And God blesses you when you do something, right? Now, there's confusion as to the role of government. In the Bible, there are clearly commands to 5 groups: individuals, families, business, church, and government. The commands to the individual includes taking care of the poor. Family commands are mostly relational. Husbands, love your wives. Children, submit to your parents. Business commands are do an honest day's work, and employers don't hold back the wages. The church definitely is commanded to take care of the poor, and historically they did. They immediately started feeding the orphans and the widows, and through the centuries started hospitals and medical clinics and dug wells in villages and gave out shoes and all kinds of stuff. Did you know there's no command for the government to take care of the poor? The command of the government's the shortest: protect the innocent, punish the guilty, right, and defend the borders. There's no command for the government to be involved in education. There's no command for the government to be involved in health care. Education, most schools were started by churches. I mean, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, they were all church schools. In the Middle Ages, there was the Catholics that started the university system in Milan and Bologna and Oxford. And then healthcare. 8 of the 10 largest hospital corporations in America were started by Catholics, and then they were started by the Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians and Christians and, Seventh-day Adventists. It's always the Christians, and prior to FDR, it was Christians that did everything. So after the Second Great Awakening revival, early 1800s, you had a preacher named Charles Finney that said, being a Christian is more than just hearing a sermon. You got to do something. And so his lectures on revival were read by George Williams over in England, and he did something. He started the YMCA, Young Men's Christian Association. Finney's lectures were read by William and Catherine Booth, and they did something. They started the Salvation Army. And then you had Christians starting the abolitionist movements and the different, women's suffrage and temperance movements. And here's Clara Barton, a school teacher, and she starts the Red Cross. These are individuals doing it on their own. And most of them are Christian, and it's not the government. It wasn't until Franklin Roosevelt comes along, and with his New Deal, and then really bad with LBJ's Great Society welfare state, that the government began to take away the church's responsibilities. And now a generation has gone by, and we forgot we ever did it. And James Madison said, charity is no part of the legislative duty of the government. Representative Davy Crockett, before he dies in the Alamo, he was in Washington, D.C., and there was a fire. It burnt part of Georgetown, and Congress was going to give some of your tax money to rebuild Georgetown. And Davy Crockett said, Congress hath not the power to appropriate this money as an act of charity. Every member on this floor knows it. We have the rights as individuals to give away as much of our own money as we please in charity. But as members of Congress, we have no right to appropriate $1 of the public money as charity. Calvin Coolidge says, it does not follow that because something ought to be done, the national government ought to do it. We need to take care of the poor. Yes, we do, but it's not the government's job. We need to take care of the immigrants. Yes, we do, but it's not the government's job. We need to do this, that. We need to do all that, but it's not the government's job. All right? That's why I was talking with Jeff McCrae, and he's talking about your governor cutting back on the number of laws, right? People that don't know the history say, let's pass another law, another law. No, it's not the government's job to do everything. Gerald Ford said, people say, why don't you expand that program and spend more federal money? I look them in the eye and say, do you realize that a government big enough to give us everything we want is a government big enough to take from us everything we have? Now, what if older fish could tell younger fish to stay away from shiny things dangling in the water? But they can't. So every new generation of younger fish sees that shiny thing, they're attracted to it and caught. Socialism is a shiny thing dangling in the water. Free food, free clothes, free education, free welfare. Free. Free is attractive, but there's a hook there. You give up control of your life. You give up your independence. Now, when the church helps anybody, it's called disinterested benevolence. You're helping them for no other reason than to help them, and hopefully they'll get better off and help the next needy person that comes along. Whenever the government helps anybody, it's always in exchange for something. You're in Egypt, you need food. The government will give you food in exchange for your cattle, your land, your children, your lives, your votes. When the church helps people, the person doing the giving feels the joy of the Lord in helping a needy person. And then the recipient experiences the love of God through a real person. And a relationship is established, and it grows into the body of Christ. Whenever the government helps anybody, it is always impersonal. You don't know whose pocketbook that money came out of that turned into your welfare check, and you don't care. And instead of being grateful, the recipient begins to view it as a debt that is owed to them, and they get irate if it's discontinued. And then there's an interesting phenomenon. Over time, the recipient begins to feel bad about themselves. They see other people working, and they know they're just getting this check, and they want to channel that negative feeling somewhere. They want to blame somebody other than themselves. They end up blaming the very government that is giving them the free stuff. They end up hating the very government. Here they are receiving it. And what do? They demonstrate against that government. So the Pilgrims, they switch from company to covenant. What's that? They switch from an involuntary system to a voluntary system. Instead of the bylaws saying, okay, everything is going to be taken away from you, held in common and redistributed, and it's involuntary. No, you get stuff, and then you get the voluntary opportunity to give away and take care of your neighbor. So this is called a covenant form of government. It's a triangle. And the Puritans and Pilgrims got the idea from ancient Israel, where you get rights and blessings from God, and you voluntarily take care of your neighbor as unto God. Jesus says, whatever you do to the least of these, my brethren, you've done unto me. So Margaret Thatcher says, the Decalogue, 10 Commandments, are addressed to each and every person. This is the origin of the sanctity of the individual. Your founding fathers came over that. With that, they looked after one another not only as a matter of necessity, but as a matter of duty to their God. They looked after one another as a matter of duty to their God. Right? So I'm helping you because I'm doing it as unto the Lord, not because there's this government that's taking it away from me and redistributing it. So the idea came from ancient Israel. You got these New England pastors. They're getting ideas from the Bible. What part of the Bible? That first 400-year period before King Saul. It is called the Hebrew Republic. And the scholars in Europe through the 1500s are not only thrilled they can read the Bible in their own language, they focus on a part of the Bible, that 400-year period before King Saul. And we don't appreciate how unique that is until you look at all the other governments. So I spent a couple years researching. I literally decided to go through every century of recorded human history and look at what the form of government was. And you have Nimrod, Tower of Babel, kings of Assyria, kings of Babylon, kings of Persia, 2,000 years of Egyptian pharaohs, Indian Maharajas. Raja means king, Maha means great. You had 5,000 years of Chinese emperors. You had Germanic chieftains and African chieftains. Everything is kings. Everything is gang leaders. And when Israel comes out of Egypt around 1400 BC, for 400 years there's no king. And so this was studied by the pastors in New England. And so think of government as a line. One side is total government, the other side's no government. Total government, you get a king, he rules through fear. You do what he says or he kills you. No government, that would be anarchy, unless each person is taught the law. I was trying to think of a way of explaining it. It's like each person downloads a behavioral app on their iPhone. Instead of a GPS app telling you where to turn 50 yards ahead, right? It's a behavioral. It tells you how to act in real time. Don't steal from that person. Don't lose your temper at that person. And the Levites are the computer geeks that help you to download the app. And so everybody in Israel has gone to the app store, right? The Levites, and they said, okay, line upon line, press this button here, and they would all download this, and they'd have the law in their heart. But the big question is, why would you follow it? What would motivate you to follow an internal moral? Ancient Israel had the key ingredient. There is a God who is watching everyone. He wants you to be fair, and he's going to hold you accountable in the future. So you're about to steal, there's no police anywhere, you know you can get away with it, and then you think, God is watching me, He wants me to be fair, He's going to hold me accountable in the future? Maybe I should hesitate stealing. And so it creates something in your head called the conscience. If everybody in the country really believes this, you can maintain complete order with no police. Maximum liberty. Women can go anywhere without fear, and you don't have to, worry about anybody stealing. Now, God knew the Israelites would sin, and rather than them walk around the rest of their life with a guilty conscience, waiting to be held accountable, once a year they would have the Day of Atonement, and everyone's sins in the whole country would be forgiven for the past year, and they could start off the new year with a clean slate. And of course, this is foreshadowing Jesus. He is our atonement. Once and for all, He shed His blood so we could be forgiven. Ronald Reagan said, without God, there's no virtue, because there's no prompting of the conscience. If there's no God, laws are just things made up by a bunch of old men. Why follow them? Right? Then it turns into whoever's got the biggest army will force the other one to follow them. Right? So if we get rid of this God, all you got is a bunch of these laws, and then people say, I'm not motivated to follow them, and then they end up yielding to their selfish side, and there's robbing and stealing and random violence, and then people begin to say, we need some governor to come along and fix this mess. And that's what happened in ancient Israel. And so what happened is the priests stopped teaching the law. You say they did? Yeah, here's Eli, the high priest. His own sons are sleeping with women in the very tent where the Ark of the Covenant is. And then you got a Levite with a silver graven image in the house of a guy named Micah. The tribe of Dan comes along and steals the graven image and tells this Levite, come along with us, you can be a priest to our whole tribe. And you're reading the story saying, what's this priest doing with a graven image? Isn't that one of the commandments? You're not supposed to have them? Shows they're not following the law, much less teaching. And then a Levite with a concubine. The law says the Levite is to marry a virgin of his own tribe. Here he is with a woman he's not even married to. He's not following the law. And they're traveling, and the house they're in is surrounded by sodomites. Something about that behavior that appears at the very last stages of a people ruling themselves. This casting off of self-restraint, abandonment to passion, very similar to Plato, who said the young man gives into useless and unnecessary pleasures, even incest and unnatural union. Right? Or J.D. Unwin, the sexual promiscuity always precedes the collapse of a civilization. And so what happens? Israel is turning into chaos. And they're killing each other and everything. And then they all go to Samuel the prophet and they say, says every man does what is right in their own eyes. That's literally the same exact words that Plato writes 600 years later. So the Israel preceded Plato. And so what happened? It turns into an unstructured mess. And that's when they ask for a king. And Samuel cries, and the Lord tells Samuel, they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. So God's original plan for Israel was to not have a king, have everybody be taught the law and accountable to God to follow it, and everybody own private property, everybody be blessed, everybody to have a weapon, everybody, right? But they rejected that, and they got a king. So democracies and republics are based on the people having virtue. But when the people give up virtue, it turns into chaos, and that's when they want some governor to come along and fix it, and the rubber band snaps back into the hands of a king. Can you see that, how that works? So King Saul rules as a tyrant, and at first he's all smiles, right? He's nice and handsome, but then he begins to grow unpopular, and so we see that he's pouting, that his son Jonathan became friends with David. He turns to his soldiers and says, none of you soldiers care about little old me. One soldier, Doeg the Edomite, says, King, I care. I saw David go to this town, and the priests there gave him some bread and the sword of Goliath. And Saul says, bring those priests to me. And when they arrive, he turns to his soldiers and says, kill them. The soldiers hesitate. Doeg the Edomite says, I'll kill them, goes out there and kills them all. What just happened? The soldiers had been operating under the old system where everybody individually is accountable to God to follow the law, and the law says you need 2 or more witnesses before you condemn someone to death. There's only one witness, Doeg. So the soldiers are hesitating. They still have a conscience. right? Doeg says, King, I'm going to surrender my conscience to you. You tell me to kill, I'll kill. So like the My Lai massacre during the Vietnam War, right? The guy said, well, I was just following orders and I killed this whole village. Kings want to have you give up your conscience. They want you to give up your convictions. They want you to give up your body. They want to, and when they say kill the baby in the womb, they want you to kill it. When they say there's no more man and woman, they want you to just give it up. They want to just dictate all your beliefs. And some of the people are like, Doeg, okay, King, whatever you tell me to do, what do you want me to do next? You want me to kill somebody else? God's jealous. He doesn't want the government between you and him. And our country was founded by people that didn't want the king to tell them how to believe. And so that's when they came over here, they insisted on freedom of conscience. That you should be able to have exceptions from government mandates if your conscience, even Thomas Jefferson's famous Virginia statute on religious freedom says, no man shall be molested or punished for their freedom of conscience. And so I'm going to show 4 slides, and we're going to see how covenant turned into communism. So Israel had a covenant form of government, rights from God. You take care of your neighbor because you're accountable to God. The century after the Pilgrims, covenant turned into social contract with the Age of Enlightenment. And so this was, if God's there, he's distant. This comes out of the scientific revolution, where you have Kepler discovering laws of planetary motion, and Isaac Newton discovering laws of gravity, and Robert Boyle discovering laws of pressure. And so some theologians said, well, maybe God made everything with laws, and like a guy winds up a clock with all the gears, he's off taking a walk, and everything's just following these gears. So if God's there, yeah, he made stuff, but if he's there, he's impersonal. He's distant. He's not involved. Don't even bother praying because it won't make a difference. And the ultimate of this is Spinoza's, God is an impersonal force in the universe. So we go from pilgrim, covenant with a personal God, to the Age of Enlightenment, social contract with an impersonal God. Next century, it's the French Revolution, which is social contract with no God. You get your rights from the group, you're accountable to the group decides what's right and wrong because there's no God. You don't have any rights other than what, and then the century after the French Revolution, you have Marxism and socialism where the state is God. And so let's look at the French Revolution. So King Louis XIV had this huge empire, and then his grandson is Louis XVI. He's the one who helped us during the Revolution. And you know what he got in exchange for helping us? Nothing but debt. And then their crops failed. And the people of France said that if they can, remember when they went to Queen Marie Antoinette and said, the people don't have bread. And she said, let them eat cake, right? It wasn't her fault. She just grew up in court. But so the people thought if they could just chop off the king and queen's heads, all their problems will be solved. Well, they chop them off, doesn't get better. So they chop off the heads of all the royalty. Doesn't get better. So they chop off all the heads of the wealthy. You got money, we don't, you're selfish. Then they chop off the heads of the businessmen and farmers. You got food and supplies, we don't, you're selfish. Then they chop off the heads of the hoarders. You got extra food, we don't have enough, you're selfish. Then they chop off the heads of the clergy because they're speaking out against all the head chopping off stuff. Then they chopped off the heads of the former revolutionaries, the ones that used to chop off heads but got tired of it, somehow they're to blame. 30,000 people had their heads chopped off in Paris, France. They even invented a nice clean machine to do it called the guillotine. You know what the motto of the French Revolution was? Liberty, equality, fraternity. Sounds nice, except it doesn't work. Liberty is experienced individually. Fraternity is their word for socialism. It's the fraternity, the group, the collective, the club, the mob, the state. And equality can be understood 2 ways. In America, it was equal treatment before the law. In France, it was everyone having an equal amount of stuff, equity. And if the fraternity thinks you have too much stuff, it can trample your individual liberty, confiscate all of your stuff, redistribute it, and even kill you. During this time in America, our founders are freaking out. They thought, hey, France was our friend, and now they're doing this crazy stuff. And so the president of Yale is Timothy Dwight. And he talks about before our revolution, we had a great awakening revival with preachers and George Whitefield. Before the French Revolution, they had Voltaire. About the year 1728, Voltaire, so celebrated for his wit and his hatred of Christianity, formed a systematical design to destroy Christianity and to introduce in its stead a general diffusion of irreligion and atheism. The being of God was denied and ridiculed. The possession of property was pronounced robbery. You got food, we don't, you're selfish. Right? Chastity, natural affection were declared to be nothing more than groundless prejudices. All right? This sort of sounds like that J.D. Unwin, right? Sexual promiscuity. Adultery, assassination, poisonings, and crimes of other like infernal nature were taught as lawful, provided the end was good. So it's okay for you to smash windows of some store owner if you are pushing your political agenda because you think that's good. The education of youth, books replete with infidelity, irreligion, immorality, and obscenity. They want to go after those kids, what's being taught to them. It says, to destroy us, therefore, our enemies must first destroy our Sabbath and seduce us from the house of God. What's that? You got to stop believing there's a God, right? Like we talked about in ancient Israel, you get rid of God, you got a bunch of rules that some old men made up, why follow them? And then they're going to stop following them, then it's going to turn into chaos, and then you're going to have a dictator. So during the French Revolution, they had what's called the Reign of Terror, where the government was committing terrorist attacks on its own population. And they began to tear down statues, like the statue of good King Henry IV, who tried to patch up Protestants and Catholics in the 1500s. And then St. Genevieve, they dug up her bones and trashed them. Who is she? 450 AD, Attila the Hun has an army of 500,000 men. He's wiping out city after city in Europe, and he's headed toward Paris. And Genevieve gets all of Paris to fast and pray. And Attila skips sacking Paris. So she's the patron saint of Paris. But during the French Revolution, they dig up her bones and trash them. Why do you want to get rid of people in history? It's something called deconstruction, where you separated people from their past by portraying the past negatively, and then you have the people in a neutral, open-minded position, and then you give them your pitch for whatever future you have presented positively. It's a sales technique. So if I was a toothpaste salesman, the first thing I do is tell you negative things about the toothpaste you're currently brushing with. You're still brushing with that stuff? Haven't you read it'll eat the enamel off your teeth? And now you're repulsed by it, so you're open-minded. What are all the new toothpastes out there? Then I give you my pitch for this brand new tartar-controlled breath freshener toothpaste. So it's a drive neutral reverse. It's like taking out an old, the operating system, putting in a new. It's like taking out the old DNA and putting in the new. So they go into the classrooms and they tell the kids negative things about the founding fathers. They took land from Indians. They sold people into slavery. They were chauvinists. Forget the fact they gave you a country where you're in charge of your life. And these students are repulsed by the founding fathers. Now you got the kids in a neutral. They're open-minded. What are all the belief systems out there? Then you give them a pitch for socialism or LGBT or Sharia Islam. And now let's look at Europe. Europe went from 1,000 years of Catholic cathedrals, Protestant Reformation, and Jewish neighborhoods to a secular Europe with the French Revolution, free sex, anything goes, and John Lennon's Imagine There's No Heaven, there's no, right? So there's anchorless, borderless, and now it's turning into a Sharia socialist Europe, with Mohammed being the #1 name for newborns. And yeah, the government pays for your education, but it also decides what path you're going to go. And if you score bad on a test, then it channels you into a career path that you can't get out of. So the French Revolution, they wanted to erase Judeo-Christian influence. Why? Because Judeo-Christian influence is you have rights as an individual. They don't like individual, they like group. Right? So they want you to stop thinking that you have rights from a creator, and they want you to start thinking that your rights come from the group. So they got to get rid of any belief that says you have rights from a creator. And they destroy religious monuments. They desecrate graves. Religious meetings prohibited. Churches closed. Christian schools banned. Church education outlawed. No private or public worship allowed. They even killed nuns. I mean, what harm is a nun going to do? The nuns ran the hospitals. Matter of fact, the Sisters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul have the oldest hospital in Europe. It was right next door to the Notre Dame Cathedral, the Hotel Dieu, and they started hundreds of cathedrals across France and Europe. Well, during the French Revolution, they brought these nuns in and forced them to give up their faith, and they wouldn't. And so they marched them up to the guillotine, and they're like singing their song, Psalm 119 or 117, and one by one, they get their head chopped off. And another one gets their head chopped off. There would be one less person singing, until finally nobody else is singing. And Robespierre is the head of their government, their party, and he says, lead the people by terror. Basis of popular government during a revolution is terror. Terror is nothing more than swift, severe, and flexible justice. So every day, Robespierre would come into the French Assembly and have a new list of people to be investigated for insurrections, for planning stuff against their new secular government, and they would round them up and chop their heads off. And priests and ministers and those who harbored them were executed on sight. Did a similar thing happen in Mexico in 1917, killed about 1 million people. But France, there's a rural area, a farming area called the Vendée. It is hundreds of miles away from Paris. They think they're safe, and suddenly a federal army shows up, and it kills 300,000 men, women, and children in the first modern genocide. And this became the model for every socialist revolution since. You kill off the old order. Kill off people that believe that you have rights from a creator, and then you can do your new liberté, equality, fraternité. Robespierre even puts a prostitute in Notre Dame Cathedral, covers her with a sheet, said this is the goddess of reason, let's worship her. They don't want done in the year of the Lord, so they make 1792 the new year 1 of the Republic. They don't want a 7-day week because it goes to the Bible. They came up with a 10-day week. Each day had 10 hours, each hour had 100 minutes, each minute had 100 seconds. They said 10 was the number of man because you count with 10 fingers. They made every measurement in France divisible by 10. They called it the metric system. Maybe that's why I never really liked the metric system. Well, during this French Revolution, there's no God, so who decides what's right and wrong? The mob, the state, the collective. And then out of that chaos came Napoleon, right? So democracies and republics where the people don't have morals and virtue turns into chaos. And out of that chaos, they want someone to come along and fix this mess, and that's when the rubber band snaps back and they get a dictator, and in this case, it's Napoleon. And Napoleon conquers Europe, 6 million die. And afterwards, the king of Prussia, one of the German kingdoms, said, we can't get conquered that easy again. We need to strengthen the state. And so he gets a philosopher that talks about strengthening the state, and his name's Hegel. And so go through these real quick. So we got a Pilgrim covenant where you get rights and possessions from God. You voluntarily take care of your neighbor because you're accountable to God. Next century turns into the age of enlightenment, social contract, impersonal God. Next century, French Revolution, which is social contract with no God. Next century, it's Marxism and socialism where the state is God. And so Hegel taught the state is God walking on earth. We must worship the state. All the worth which the human being possesses, he possesses only through the state. You don't have worth because you're made in the image of the Creator. There is no Creator. Here's Rousseau, who wrote The Social Contract. Rousseau said, when a state says to a citizen, it is expedient for the state that you should die, he ought to die because his life is a gift made conditionally by the state. 100 years later in Germany, you got the Nazi Ministry of Justice, authorized physicians to end the sufferings of incurable patients. No life still valuable to the state will be wantonly destroyed. All right, so they'd have these committees that would decide, well, we're going to spend state money to keep you alive, and are you going to contribute to the state? And you're not, okay, we're not going to pay for your. And then Pol Pot brought communism to Cambodia, kills 1/3 of his country. And he says, if you're helping me, then I'm fine, I'll use you, but if you're not helping me, he says, to keep you is no benefit, to destroy you is no loss. Your life is only of worth if you're helping me grab power. Hegel says the state recognizes no authority but its own. It acknowledges no abstract rules of good and bad. What's an abstract rule of good and bad? You mean like the 10 Commandments? Yeah, there's no superior law. It is just a power grab by the state. If you help the state grab power, the state thinks your life is useful to it. If you challenge the state, it uses its power to crush you. This came up during the Nuremberg trials. They're trying to convict these Nazi officers of killing Jews. And they were saying, we just followed the rules of our state. We just followed orders from the government. And these prosecutors are trying to find a way to say, well, you did something wrong by killing these Jews. They said, we're just following the orders of the state. Eisenhower said, in many lands, the state claims to be the author of human rights. If the state gives rights, it can and inevitably will take away those rights. The founding fathers had to refer to the Creator in order to make the revolutionary experiment make sense. In other words, do our rights come from the government or do they come from a source higher than the government? If rights come from God, then the government's job is to protect and guarantee to you your God-given rights. But if there is no God, the rights come from the collective, the group, the fraternity. And what the government giveth, the government can taketh awayeth. Eisenhower, it was because all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights that men could dare to be free. So, we talked about the most common form of government in world history is kings. And so socialism is, in a sense, just a sales job for dictatorship. It's a bait and switch. And now I had a thought, because you're so kind to come out tonight, we can take a short 10-minute break, and then if you wanted to use the restrooms and look at the book table, and then we can come back in 10 minutes. Would that be something that you'd, okay, why don't we go ahead and plan on coming back at 7:15, how's that? And I'll finish it, and we're going to talk about this question, is how to, here we go, how to take power from the people.